What was the Holy Grail? Because there's not necessarily a consensus as to what it is. Some people say it's a cup, others a stone. What is the Holy Grail?
Yeah, okay, so the Holy Grail, one of the central components of Arthurian history, and it comes straight out of biblical history, of course, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But what is it? It's a multifaceted item, and it's deliberately multifaceted in order to cover up what it is. So again, it's one of those heretical things that no one wanted to talk about. But they wanted to preserve its history, and so they covered up what it is. On the first level, it is the Grail. It is the dish. It is the cup that held the blood of Christ, that Joseph of Arimathea took his blood from the cross. But that is only a cover story. And they used this clever, which everybody knows about, I think, this clever wordplay where the San Grail becomes the Sang Grail. So the San Grail is the holy dish. That's the cup. But if you swap the letters over a little bit, you get the Sang Grail, which is the holy blood, which is the bloodline of Jesus and the kings who went before him. It's the Egyptian bloodline. That's why the cup held the blood of Jesus, because it is the bloodline. So that is the first layer and the second layer, as it were, of the Grail story. But within Arthurian history, they mention the Grail cup, but they always have the Grail associated with a princess. So they have a procession. So they have the Knights of the Round Table around the round table, and the table is hollow, as it were. It's got an empty center, so it's not a complete table. It's a ring with a center in the middle, and the Grail is brought in and paraded around, and it's brought in by a princess, and the Grail feeds all of the Knights of the Round Table, and that is the Grail procession, and everyone looks at the Grail, and they all understand it in different fashions. And then you have a further reference, a further uncovering of what the Grail is, because within Parsifal, they have the same Grail procession as before, but the princess is not holding a chalice. She doesn't have the Grail cup. And so she comes and she stands before what's his name? Firefitz, who's one of the new Knights of the Round Table. And the knights say to him, "Can you see the Grail?" And all he can see is a princess holding a green cloth. And he says, "No, I can't see it." And he's looking around, he's looking for the Grail. And of course, all of the other knights are falling around in fits of laughter, because what he doesn't understand is the Grail is the princess. And that's it doesn't say this, so you've got to work it out for yourself. This is one of the tests within Arthurian history. The manuscript doesn't say what the Grail is, but you've got to work out that actually Firefitz can't see the cup, because the cup is not a cup, it's a princess. In fact, the cup is her womb, because this is the bloodline, and the bloodline flows through the princess. So, princes who were holders of the Grail were the princess of the wounded Fisher King. So the primary king of Arthurian history tends to be the wounded king and the Fisher King, and sometimes the Holy Hermit are the three main characters throughout Arthurian history. And the daughter of the Fisher King is the Grail holder. And so Queen Guinevere becomes a Grail holder at one point. So that's the sort of second, third aspect of the Grail. The other thing the Grail needs is somebody to protect it. And that's what the Knights of the Round Table are for. So they are there to protect the Holy Grail. And that's what it says, that the knights are elected to protect the Grail. And then the other thing that the Grail needs is a priest. And so we now have a priest, and the priest is the most pure and virginal of the knights. He's elected to be the priest who venerates the Grail. And he is known, and it doesn't say this exactly, but he as the Galahad. So Galahad is a title of the Grail priest. And he's called a Galley because the high priest of the Holy Grail has to be a eunuch. He has to be castrated. And so all the way through the Vulgate cycle, you get this big, long discussion about the eunuchs who are linked to the Grail and linked to the Knights of the Round Table. And so Sir Percival, Galahad, became a eunuch. Otherwise, he could not be the high priest. And surprisingly, this tradition comes from the Gospel stories again. This is from the New Testament. And you might not know this story because it's not the story that they're going to tell you when you go to church and you get your reading from the New Testament. But anyway, Jesus asked for his disciples to become eunuchs. And I'll have to quote this because I can't ever remember it. Here it is. Okay, here's the quote. Jesus said to his disciples, all men cannot receive this, saying, except those to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs which were born so to their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs who are made eunuchs of men, and there are some eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to do it, let him do it. Now this is Jesus talking to his disciples. So Jesus is asking his disciples to become eunuchs. Why? Because this is linked to Arthurian history. He is asking one of his disciples to become the holder of the Grail. So that quote I gave you from the New Testament was Matthew 19:11 and 12, if you want to look it up. So now you can see the link here between the Gospel story and the Arthurian story. So you have Jesus as the leader of the 12 disciples, who were all armed according to the New Testament, and you have Arthur, who's the leader of the 12 Knights of the Round Table. Now, History of the Holy Grail says that the Round Table, there were 3 round tables, and they were all based upon the same design. So the first round table was the table of the Last Supper. So it was a round table. It wasn't as we see it in most of the pictures. The second table was the round table of Joseph of Arimathea. And the third table was the round table of actually Uther Pendragon, who was the father of King Arthur. And so we have 3 round tables, and they are all round tables, all surrounded by 12 knights. And the king sits in the middle. So Jesus would have been in the center of the Last Supper table, surrounded by his 12 disciples, knight disciples. And Arthur was the same. He was sitting in the middle of the table, surrounded by his 12 knights of the Round Table. And of course, we'll come on to this again, but this 12 knights and disciples sitting around a table is actually a zodiac. So this table, this round table, Arthurian table, was actually a zodiac. And so each of the knights sitting around this table would have been identified with a particular sign of the zodiac. And the Jesus character, or the Arthurian character in the center, would either be identified with Helios, because the central component in a zodiac is either the sun, or it's the northern polar stars, which is Ursa Major. And of course, Ursa Major is the name for King Arthur. King Arthur's name came from Ursa Major. And that's why he's sitting in the center of the zodiac. And that's where we get the link between the name for Jesus and the name for King Arthur, because they were both the central character in the zodiac, was Ursa Major. Anyway, we're drifting away from the eunuchs for a minute. So coming back to the eunuchs, the eunuchs were the Galahad, and the Galli were the Galileans. And of course, if you read the New Testament, Jesus was called a Galilean. I've got a quote for that somewhere here. Matthew 26:69. Jesus was of Galilee. He was a Galilean. He was a Galli. And the high priests of the Holy Grail were called the Galli high priests. And they are a known group from history. So this is not part of necessarily Arthurian history or biblical history. This is from real history, Roman history. And they were called the Galli. And we have several quotes about the Galli, because the Galli were eunuchs, of course, and how they became eunuchs. And one of these quotes comes from Lucian, who's a Roman historian. And he says, "On these days the Galli are made. While the rest are playing flutes and performing rites, a frenzy comes upon many, and he throws off his clothes and rushes to the center with a great shout, and takes his sword and cuts off his testicles. And then the Galli rushes through the city holding his testicles in his hands, and he throws it through a window, and he takes women's clothing from whichever window it goes through." So this is how the Galli castrated themselves. It was self-castration. And they then dressed in women's clothes because they were a Galli eunuch. And they do much the same in India. I don't know if you've seen those pictures in India. They have of the, what do they call them? The Hajri. There's a cult of eunuchs in India, and they do exactly the same sort of thing, and they wear women's dresses after they become castrated. And these Galli did exactly the same. And you might think, hold on, this is why Galahad was called a Galli. He was called a Galahad. Galahad means the chief Galli. He was the high priest of the Galli. So Sir Galahad, that wasn't his name, that was just the title. His name was Sir Percival. So we get this disconnect within Arthurian history where all of the early manuscripts call him Sir Percival. Only the later ones call him Sir Galahad. And that's because he gained the title later on. So his full title was Sir Percival Galahad. Sir Percival, the high priest of the Galli.
But the story goes that 3 knights went out in search of the Holy Grail: Sir Bors, Sir Percival, and Sir Galahad.
You will find all the time, especially in Quest of the Holy Grail, that Sir Percival is always linked, excuse me, with Lancelot, and Galahad was the son of Lancelot. They are always intermixed and confused between the two. So yes, they go together, but of course they'd go together, because so you had Bors and Percival Galahad. It wasn't 2 people, it was 1 person. It was Percival Galahad. Because otherwise there is no Galahad in all of the early manuscripts. He just does not exist. He only exists in the later manuscripts, mainly in the Vulgate cycle. And that's because he picked up this title. He became the Galli. And we also get this confusion with Wales, because they call him the Welshman. But he wasn't from Wales at all. Again, that's a very convenient misinterpretation. They interpret Galles as being Wales because the name for Wales came from the Galwars, which is their language. It's not their nation as such. And so they say he's a Welshman. But he wasn't a Welshman at all. If you read the Vulgate cycle, it will say he's a Welshman. But if you read the original Norman version, which it took me quite some time to find it, actually. The original translation, before it was translated into English, it doesn't say Welshmen at all. It says the Galleys. So he was a Galley. He was a high priest of the Galley. So all this mention of Wales throughout the whole of the Vulgate cycle is incorrect. It doesn't say Wales at all. It says Galles. So the Galileans were the eunuchs, and you might think, hold on a minute, this doesn't equate well with Percival Galahad being a knight of the Round Table. I mean, he was supposed to be a brave warrior slaughtering his enemies, and now we've got Galahad as being an effeminate eunuch wearing a dress and makeup, because they used to wear makeup and lipstick and eyeshadow and all the rest of it. And you think, hold on a minute, this doesn't suit the imagery of Sir Galahad whatsoever. How can we have Sir Galahad as being an effeminate eunuch? Well, this is exactly how they used to be. And we have this from Josephus Flavius. So you see all of these texts mixing and mingling together are all part of the same story. So we have a description of the Galileans, and this is taken from Josephus Flavius in his description of the Jewish revolt. So these are the leaders of the Jewish revolt fighting the Romans in Judea during the Jewish revolt. And he says of the Galileans, this is from Joseph's Jewish War, 4:9-10 is the reference. He says, these Galileans, and Jesus was a Galilean, of course, remember, indulged themselves in feminine wantonness. They decked their hair and put on women's garments and were smeared with ointments that they might appear very comely. They had paints under their eyes and imitated not only the ornaments but also the lusts of women. But while their faces looked like faces of women, they killed with their right hands, and while their gait was effeminate, they attacked men and became warriors. They drew their swords from under their dresses and ran everybody through that they came upon. So now we have the effeminate Galilean eunuchs as warriors, as it says. They killed with their right hands, and they attacked men and became warriors. So they were knights of the Round Table, even though they were wearing dresses. And when we talk about wearing dresses, they still do that today, of course. And then, because this was Sir Galahad, Galahad used to wear a red dress. They still do that today. If you go to Rome and you go to St. Peter's and you go to one of the main services and you see all of the cardinals and bishops arriving for the service, you will see they're all wearing red dresses. They are all dressed as Sir Galahad. And so the same tradition has still worked its way through into the Catholic Church, and the priests and the bishops of Rome still wear the same red dress. And again, this is all part of Arthurian history. You might not think it, but this is what the Vulgate cycle says.
Question from the audience. We did touch on it a little bit earlier, but if Arthur represents a Christ figure, then who was Merlin?
Yeah, good question. Yes, it all does add up. There is a Merlin character, and in the New Testament, he's actually not mentioned very much in the New Testament, but he's a big part of the Clementine recognition, so we know who this guy is, and he is mentioned once within the New Testament. The greatest magician of the first century, who was the previous Jesus almost before Jesus came along. They always said Jesus was mistaken for him because Jesus was also a magician. The greatest magician of the first century was Simon Magus. And Simon Magus was a magi, of course, one of the same as the three magi that came to the birth of Jesus. And the magi were the Persian priesthood and also magicians from the 1st century. And Simon Magus was renowned throughout Judea within the 1st century as being a magician. He did all sorts of tricks. He could fly. He made a boy appear, an ethereal boy appear, and then he made him disappear again, which sounds awfully like a camera obscura. It seems to have been a very early version of a camera obscura with an image of a boy appearing on a screen, which you can obviously do with a camera. And Simon Magus was the primary pupil of John the Baptist. So you can see where all this links in together. And it was Simon Magus who had the great debate with Simon Peter, Saint Peter, over in Caesarea. This is in the Clementine Recognitions. And we have one of these great debates about between Nazarene Judaism and simple Judaism, as I call it, which is Peter's Christianity, as to which is the correct religion. And they have this great debate. And that great debate with Simon Magus is almost identical to the great debate that they have in the city of Sarras, which we're going to come on to and talk about later, which was debated between Joseph of Arimathea and the king of Sarras. And it's almost the same debate between traditional religion and Nazarene religion and Saul Josephus, his version of Christianity. So yes, the great magician character of the 1st century, who Jesus would have known about because he was all of the same era, was Simon Magus. And it's quite obvious that that Merlin was actually Simon Magus. And within, we get two names for him. Just quickly turning over my crib sheets here. He was... There's a possibility he was actually Midrin, which is a name of a magician-type fellow from Wales, is what they say where he came from. But in Parsifal, which was written by Wolfram von Eschenbach, he's actually called Mazadan. And I think that's probably the original name, because all of the names in the Vulgate cycle are nothing to do with Welsh. I mean, this is one of the problems with traditional scholarship. They have this obsession with Wales, and Arthur being, a Celtic type character from the borders of Wales, or perhaps from Normandy. And so they try and translate everything from Welsh. And you can't do that, because if you go into the Vulgate cycle, it overtly says on numerous occasions this name came from the Aramaic. Well, actually the Chaldean, but Chaldean is the Aramaic. So all of the names within the Vulgate cycle especially are all Aramaic, Hebrew. And I think this name is also one of those names from the Hebrew. And I think Mazadan comes from Mazara or Mazala, because there are only two words that sound like this within biblical history, within the Aramaic. And Mazara is the zodiac. It's the 12 constellations of the zodiac within Judaic history. And so I think Mazadan, Merlin, his name actually comes from the 12 signs of the zodiac, because one of the greatest things within all of Arthurian legend is these allusions to the zodiac and to the 12 constellations. It's a central component of Arthurian history, is the zodiac. I mean, just for an instance, and this is going back to Monmouth and Oxford's version, one of the first versions we have of Arthurian history, is we have a birth scene for King Arthur. Now, the birth scene for King Arthur is actually the birth of Hercules. So again, you can see where this Arthurian history is coming from. It's not a Welsh story. His conception and his birth is the birth of Hercules. But then when it comes on to his actual birth, it says his birth was marked by a comet that looked like a dragon and had two rays coming out of the dragon's head. And that marked the birth of King Arthur and his sister, who was probably Queen Guinevere.
He had an incestuous relationship with his sister?
Yeah, he was married to his sister. All of these characters were married to their sister. Simon Magus was married to his sister, Luna. King Agbarus was married to his sister, Queen Helena. King Agrippa of Judea was married to his sister. All of the Egyptian royalty always married incestuously within the family. And Jesus did as well. Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, and she was his sister. In fact, he was married to both of his sisters. He married Mary and Martha, the Bethany sisters. So coming back to Arthur, he was born under this symbol of the dragon with two rays. And if we go back to the Aramaic, because all of these names are Aramaic, as it says within Arthurian history, all of the names are Aramaic. A dragon is not a dragon within Aramaic. A dragon is a fish. So now we have a fish symbol with two rays. And if anyone out there is a keen astrologer, they will know exactly what I'm talking about. Because the sign of Pisces is a fish with two rays. And so what Arthurian history is saying is that King Arthur was born under the sign of Pisces. And this tells you exactly when he was born, because the sign of Pisces only became dominant in AD 10, according to processional astrology. So all of the constellations change every 2,000 years, and we went from Aries to Pisces in AD 10, which is why Jesus was born as a Lamb of God, Aries, and became a fisher of men, Pisces.
And we're entering into Aquarius.
And we're going into Aquarius in 2450. Yeah, it's got a little while to go. But King Arthur was born at the same time. He was born under the sign of Pisces, and Monmouth and Oxford clearly state this by saying he was born under the sign of Draco, which is the fish in Aramaic, with two rays. And if you look at any sign of Pisces in an astrological manual, you'll see that Pisces has two rays. And more importantly than that, the zodiac this was taken from, I'm pretty sure, is the zodiac of Dendera, the zodiac that's in Egypt, at the Temple of Dendera in Egypt. Because if you look at that one, and it's available online, you just need to Google it, Zodiac Dendera, and have a look at the sign of Pisces, it has, at the end of the two rays of Pisces, it has one circle for Venus and the other circle for the sun, Helios. And of course, Monmouth says that the two rays, one of the rays signified Guinevere and the other ray signified King Arthur. The son and the daughter, Venus and sun. And so it's almost as if Geoffrey of Monmouth is sitting there looking at the Zodiac of Dendera, which is quite amazing that he must have seen this to have written this, or had a manuscript that described it, because his description is perfect. It comes from the Zodiac of Dendera in Egypt. So not only we see several things from that little observation. We see that this is linked to Egypt, that this is a first century story, because it is quite obviously saying that King Arthur was born in AD 10, and it's linking with biblical history, because the other person who was the other king who was born in AD 10 or thereabouts was Jesus himself. And so again we get this link between Jesus and Arthur. So, yeah, where did that come from? Oh, that came from talking about Merlin, because the name for Merlin invokes the zodiac once more, that he was the magician of the zodiac. He was the Mazdalan. And that's what Wolfram von Eschenbach calls him. He doesn't call him Merlin, he calls him Mazdalan. And we get other similar things, because we get Morgaine, the sister. Another sister of King Arthur was Morgaine. And she is the equivalent of Magdalene. It's the same name from the same source. So we were just talking about stars and comets. But Magdalene means the tower. That's where her name comes from. She was Mary Magdalene, Mary of the Tower. But she wasn't any old tower. The Magdal, within Egyptian language and history, the Magdal was a pyramid. And that's why the Old Testament calls the pyramid of Babylon, the Tower of Babel, which is a pyramid, as we know. It was one of the pyramids of Babylon. It calls it a Magdal, because a Magdal is not just simply a tower, it's a pyramid. And so Mary Magdalene was actually Mary of the Pyramid. That was her official title, because all of this religion comes out of Egypt. You know, it's nothing to do with Judea. It all came out of Egypt. They were all pharaohs of Egypt. But if you get two Magdals, if you get two pyramids and superimpose them, you get a Star of David. That's how the Star of David is formed. And the Star of David is called a Magan. It's the Magan David, which is where we get Morgaine from, Magan, Morgaine. And so effectively, if you get two Magdalens, they make one Magan, or one Morgaine. So they were all linked to stars. And of course, the Magan David was the Star of David, but it was also known as the Marian Star, which was the star of Mary. Mary, the Virgin, the mother of Jesus, was identified with the Marian Star. And the Marian Star is Venus. So it wasn't just the sign of King David, it was also the sign of Venus. And of course, Venus was the primary goddess of not only Egypt, but all of the Near and Middle East. Isis was called Ast within Egyptian. And of course, from Ast we get Ishtar, we get Estar, Astareth, Astarte. All come from Ast, or Isis. And she was Venus, of course. Isis was Venus. And so all of these queens were all identified with the star of Isis, which is the Marian star. It's the Magdal, or rather the two Magdals, which is a Morgaine. And Queen Guinevere was the same, because it's mistranslated. If you look any of this up on Wiki or in any of the historical books, it'll say that, because they're trying to translate this out of Welsh again, which is sort of all wrong. And they say that Guinevere means white, the White Queen. Well, what does that mean? I don't know. Anyway, it doesn't, because if you look at the Welsh, and this does have a connection to Welsh, the day of the week, Friday, in Welsh, is called Gwen, from which we get Guinevere. So her name means Friday. And of course, Friday, in all of the European and Near Eastern languages, Friday is the day of Venus, which is why in Italian it's, It's Veneris in Latin, and it's Vendredi in French. Vendredi, Veneris, it's Venus. It is the goddess Venus. So Friday, and it is in Germanic languages as well, because it was Freitag in the Germanic languages, and she was an incarnation of Venus. So Friday is the day of Venus, and in Welsh, that is Gwen. It's actually a corruption of the Latin. It's a very poor Welsh pronunciation of the Latin Venus. So Guinevere was actually identified with Venus, the same as all of the other queens were as well, the same as Mary Magdalene was, the same as Martha was, the same as Morgane was, the same as Mary the Virgin was. Mary the Virgin was known as the Stella Maris, the sea star, and the sea star is Aphrodite, who is Venus, who is Isis. It's all interconnected. So yeah, we have Arthur marrying Guinevere and Jesus marrying Mary Magdalene, but both of these queens are named after Venus. They're both incarnations of Venus. Complex, isn't it? It's a complex little story.
The Holy Grail, we didn't quite finish off that topic. We talked about the Grail being the bloodline of Christ, and the princess is the carrier of the Grail. But what is the Holy Grail? Is it a cup? Is it a plate? Is it a stone? What is it?
What is it? Yeah. Yeah, we missed that bit, didn't we? So we know who looks after it and who guards it. What is the Grail? Well, we only really get one good description of the Grail, and that comes from Wolfram von Eschenbach. It's in Parsifal. And he says that he got the information from Flegetanus, who was an astrologer, who knew the circuits of the planets and the stars and the earth and everything. And he says actually that Flegetanus came from Toledo after it had been rescued from Muslim control. But I think he's being disingenuous there. I think he's actually referring to Edessa, when Edessa had been liberated from Muslim oppression and control. Because it just so happens that the princess of Edessa and Saras, which we will talk about later, was called Flegetanus. So this astrologer was not a man, as he seems to indicate. It was a princess, it was a lady. And he got this information about the Grail from Flegetanus. And Wolfram says that the Grail was the lapsit exilis, which means, if you translate it, that's obviously Latin, if you translate it, it's the stone from heaven. And this is interesting because it ties in what we were talking about before when we did our talk about Jesus, King of Edessa and so on, when we talked about the sacred stones of Edessa, which were supposed to be meteoric. And so we had the main stone we were talking about was the Elagabal, which was the stone that was venerated by Emperor Elagabalus, which was supposed to be meteoric. And of course, a stone from heaven is a good description of a meteor coming in. But Wolfram goes a little bit further than this. He doesn't just say it's a meteor. He says that the Grail stone was brought to Earth by aliens, and it was given a royal bloodline to look after from thereafter. And so the Grail bloodline, who inherited this very sacred stone, was the family of Jesus, and obviously the family before that, going back into Egypt, because the Grail stone is obviously the Benben stone. It's the Benben stone from Egypt, which became the Omopholos stone from Greece, and became the Elagabal stone of Emperor Elagabalus, who came from Syria. And it's identified with the phoenix, and that's quite interesting because Wolfram says that the Grail stone was closely associated with the phoenix. And he would not have known about this from the coinage that we have, because we know about this because we have the coins of Elagabalus. But I can't imagine that anyone in the 13th century would have had coins of Elagabalus. But if you look at the stones, and they're in my book, and you can look them up online as well, the coins of Elagabalus show the Elagabal stone in a chariot embossed with the phoenix. So Wolfram, writing in the 13th century, knew all about this back in the 13th century, and he's describing the Elagabal. So it's quite obvious that the Grail stone, the actual Grail that was being looked after, tended by a princess, guarded by the Knights of the Round Table, and venerated by the bishop, who was the chief knight of the Round Table, who happened to be Sir Percival Galahad, that this Grail was a stone, a sacred stone. And this links us back into the New Testament again, because, of course, the chief of the Round Table, the Last Supper Round Table of Jesus, the chief of the Round Table was St. Peter. And, of course, his name means the stone. So the proper name of Peter was not Peter, of course. He was called Simon, and he was given the title Peter Kephas, which is the same title in Greek and Aramaic, respectively. And both Peter and Kephas mean the stone. So his name was Simon the Stone. Why? Because he was the keeper of the stone. He was the keeper of the Holy Grail. So within the New Testament story, we have a Grail keeper. Even though the Grail is not specifically mentioned, the high priest that looked after the Grail was St. Peter. And so St. Peter would have been a eunuch. And this is why we have the story about Jesus on the Mount of Olives, if you remember, just before he was arrested. He was having a ceremony on the Mount of Olives where an ear got cut off. And I don't think it was an ear, because after the ear was cut off, if you remember in the gospel story, a boy escaped naked, leaving his robes, and he escaped naked off the Mount of Olives. So what was a naked boy doing at this ceremony of Jesus on the Mount of Olives? I think the ear that got cut off was not an ophus, it was an us. It was not an ear, it was a set of testicles. And St. Peter was going through the ceremony to become he was becoming the next the next Galilean. And so St. Peter, and there are several ways of identifying St. Peter within this story, but within Arthurian history, St. Peter is Sir Percival. And that's where he fits into the Arthurian story. So King Arthur is King Jesus. St. Peter is Sir Percival, because Sir Percival did exactly the same to himself. Sir Percival castrated himself.
And Sir Percival is Sir Galahad.
Is Sir Galahad. His title was Galahad, the Galley, the high priest. Sir Percival was tested for his virginity by the devil in the form of a woman. The devil always comes in the form of a woman. And she tries to seduce Sir Percival. And the way he gets out of her charms is he draws his sword and he castrates himself. So Sir Percival becomes a galley, and that gained the title Galahad, because he became a eunuch. So for many reasons, and this is mentioned again in another part in History of the Holy Grail, where we have the whole story of St. Peter. And it's quite obvious from that section as well that St. Peter is actually Sir Percival. And this is interesting because it gives us another family history as to who St. Peter is, because we're not exactly sure who St. Peter is, within the family of the disciples. But within Arthurian history, Sir Percival and Galahad, there are two fathers. But of course this is one person, so these two fathers have to be the same. So we have two versions of similar stories with two fathers mentioned. Now the first father is Joseph of Arimathea. You can see the problem here because Joseph is a first century character. So the father of Galahad is Joseph of Arimathea. And in the second story about the father of Galahad is Sir Lancelot. So Joseph of Arimathea was Lancelot.
But that was that Galahad that is related to Josephus is the ancestor to Sir Galahad.
No. He is Sir Galahad. This is the problem, you see. All of these characters within Arthurian history are actually first-century characters. I mean, starting in High History has the full genealogy of the Arthurian family. And Sir Percival, in that history, is the great cousin of Joseph of Arimathea. You see the problems. Immediately within the first few pages within High History, it has Sir Percival as being a first-century character related to Joseph of Arimathea. The father of Percival owned the donkey that belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. Now, either you've got a donkey that lived for 500 years, or there is something wrong with the chronology here. And the reason why the father of Sir Percival had the donkey that belonged to Joseph of Arimathea is because all of this is a first-century story. So, yeah, this is where St. Peter fits into the story. St. Peter is Sir Percival, and this is why Sir Percival is described in High History especially as being a fool. He's a country bumpkin, and he's mocked. And of course, this is exactly how Josephus would have written it, because Josephus did not like St. Peter. This is Saul Josephus Flavius. He had a great contention within Acts of the Apostles, within the Gospels. He had a great contention with St. Peter. He didn't like him. He thought it was a fool. And within High History, again, Sir Percival is described as being a rustic fool because he was St. Peter. It's one and the same story. It's very complex, but this is what I like about these books that I've written, especially this one, because I was doing some research, obviously, for this talk. So I was rereading the book, and it's 600 pages. It's quite a large book. And I was going through it again, and I was thinking, geez, that's wonderful. Where did this guy get this information from? And I'm thinking, that was me, wasn't it? It's such a large book that I have forgotten myself what I've written, because, I mean, it's 600 pages of it, and there are little snippets, and wonderful translations all the way through this book. So everywhere you go, you suddenly come across something, and you'll think, wow, that's marvelous. Where did that come from? That's another new idea. And all the way through this book, you will find, I mean, there's 600 pages. You'll probably find, 300 novel ideas within this book that you've not read about before. It's just absolutely, and it can be challenged with a flow, because you can't do it by reading one page. You've got to understand the full history and how actually dovetails into the gospel history.
How does Joseph of Arimathea fit into Arthurian history?
Yeah, he is one of the central characters, as I said, because this is actually a first century story. And so, especially within history of the Holy Grail and also in Quest, but mainly in history of the Holy Grail, he is the primary character. And he, as I said before, a couple of hours ago, he was a colleague of Emperor Vespasian. We had this 40-year chasm, and he became a colleague of Emperor Vespasian. But Emperor Vespasian sent him and his son, who was called Josephus, just to confuse matters. And this Josephus is said to be a witness of Scripture and a great author and adds in brackets at the bottom, but not Josephus Flavius, although he sounds like Josephus Flavius. Yeah, okay. So the son of Joseph of Arimathea was called Josephus, and they are sent to Sarras, which is a very famous place, actually, within Arthurian history, but he knows where it is. If you read a standard interpretation of Arthurian history, they'll say that Sarras is in Egypt. I don't know why they keep pulling the wrong direction, because the story says that Josephus went to Babylon. Okay, I know that Cairo was once called Babylon, but it specifically says he was going towards the Euphrates. So he was obviously going towards the Babylon, which is in Iraq, of course. So he was heading towards Iraq from Judea, going up towards the Euphrates. So it's quite obvious that Sarras has to be somewhere in Syria or Iraq. And since he had only got halfway, the halfway point between Babylon and Judea was traditionally the city of Palmyra. So this was actually a trade route. Well, it was a trade route. It was also a pilgrim's route, because the Jews of Iraq, because you've got to remember that Iraq used to be Jewish mostly, because the Jews were taken to Babylon on Babylonian exile, and most of them stayed there. So Iraq was predominantly Jewish. But to do their pilgrimage down to Jerusalem, they used to come across the desert through Palmyra, and that was the halfway point. So it's quite obvious that Joseph of Arimathea was going to Palmyra. So Palmyra is Sarras. Why did it call it Sarras and not Palmyra? Well, A, it didn't want to give the game away, because there is a prohibition on mentioning the royal family of Edessa within biblical history and Josephus's history. So if you look through all of Josephus' works and type in Edessa, it will say, not there. Same with King Agbarus and King Mano. They're all deleted from his history. So nobody can mention Edessa and Palmyra. And Arthurian history is doing exactly the same. It's deleting Palmyra from the history and calling it Sarras instead. Why does it call it Sarras? Because Sarras in Aramaic means eunuch. So it was the city of the eunuchs, and that's what it was, because that's where the Galileans lived. The high priest came from Palmyra. And this is where we get another confusion with Wales, of course, because there are two stories, as we were talking about before, about Galahad. Galahad, one of them, went to Hosalis, which is said to be Wales, and after he was made the Galley high priest, it was called Wales. But Hosalis means, and this is what it actually says in the Old Testament, Hosalis means the eunuch. And then it was called Galles or Wales, but Galles is the high priest of the eunuchs. And the other Sir Galahad in the other story went to Sarras in Syria, which is Palmyra. And of course Sarras means the eunuch. So quite obviously Hosalis and Sarras are the same place. I mean, this is obviously the same story. He didn't go to Wales at all. It's got nothing to do with Wales whatsoever. And he was actually going towards Palmyra. Why? Well, because we have exactly the same story written by Josephus Flavius. After the Jewish revolt, Josephus Flavius was commissioned by the Romans, by Emperor Vespasian. He was commissioned to write a complete history of the Jewish revolt, because what Emperor Vespasian wanted to do was to quell any revolts on the eastern side of the empire. So he wrote this book to say that if you rise up against Rome, you will be squashed. And of course the whole of Judea was destroyed in that particular battle. And so that was the whole goal of this large book called The Jewish War. It was to scare people into not revolting. And then Vespasian sent Josephus Flavius to, and how does he pronounce it? He says, to the Adiabeni and the Jews, the Babylonian Jews beyond the Euphrates, who are the Edessans, of course, because Edessa is beyond the Euphrates. So Josephus Flavius was sent by Vespasian on exactly the same journey to Palmyra and to Edessa, in the same direction, the same location across the Euphrates. And Arthurian history says exactly the same about Josephus of Arimathea. This is why I am saying, of course, that Joseph of Arimathea was Josephus Flavius, because Arthurian history says exactly the same thing. It says that God sent Josephus of Arimathea to this place up towards the Euphrates in order to evangelize his new form of simple Judaism, Christianity. And it's the same journey, it's the same story. All you've got to do is delete God and put Vespasian into the particular paragraph, and it reads exactly the same as Josephus Flavius. It was Vespasian who sent Joseph of Arimathea to Palmyra and to Edessa in order to evangelize them, to stop them having further revolts. Because Joseph of Arimathea was the colleague of Emperor Vespasian. And the reason why they were sent to this location is because the royal family that started the Jewish revolt was the royal family of Edessa and Palmyra. It was the Edessan royal family. It was King Esus Manu of Edessa. And King Esus Manu of Edessa is King Jesus Emmanuel of the biblical story. So Josephus, this is Josephus Flavius of Arimathea now, they are one character, had a difficult mission. So he's being sent by Vespasian to deliver this book. So he's written the Jewish War, and he has to deliver this book and tell them to disarm, which they don't want to do, of course. I mean, they still have an army. And, of course, Rome doesn't know what they're going to do with this army. Are they going to restart the revolt? Are they going to disarm? Are they going to be peaceful? But in addition to that, he wants Josephus of Arimathea to change their religion, because the whole problem with the Nazarenes was that their religion was quite martial, military. It was quite aggressive. And so he wanted him to change their religion too into simple Judaism, Christianity, to try and quell any further thoughts of revolt. So he goes off to Sarras, the city of the eunuchs, and he meets there King Evelach Mordrain. And again, nobody knows who Evelach Mordrain is. But this was a wonderful piece of Pesha within Judaic history. They have a tradition of Pesha, which is, I think we talked about this before, where they cover up the names of people, like calling Jesus Balaam or calling Jesus Kamsa. They cover up people's names by comparing them with people in the past who have similar lives. And Arthurian history has done exactly the same thing with King Evelach. And all of this proves that the gospel story is the same as the Arthurian story. Because what they have done here, they've got this King Evelach, who is the son, his Pesha name, it's like an anagram. It's an anagram of the son of King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king who destroyed Jerusalem. So you can see what they've done here. Pesha is all about identifying people in the past who had similar lives. And what had just happened now? Well, we'd just had the Jewish revolt, which ended up with the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple of the Jews, the temple of Jerusalem. Who was the previous king who destroyed the temple of Jerusalem? Well, that was Nebuchadnezzar. So you've got a Pesher comparison between these two kings. And you can use that Pesher comparison by calling the contemporary king, who's King Esus Manu, you could call him Nebuchadnezzar if you wanted. And everyone who was in the know would know you were talking about King Esus because Nebuchadnezzar had the same life. And what they've done here is they've talked about the son of Nebuchadnezzar. So the son of Nebuchadnezzar was called Evil-Merodach. And the king of Saras, who would have been the next king in line from King Esus, they are calling him King Evelach-Mordrain, and it's an anagram of the two. They are the same person. So King Evelach-Mordrain is the equivalent of the son of King Nebuchadnezzar because his father also destroyed Jerusalem. And from this, we can discover that the king of Palmyra was the son of Jesus. It was his son. So the father was King Esus Manu, who was the biblical Jesus. The son is King Evelach of Palmyra, because Palmyra was it was probably the biggest city within the empire of the Edessans. The Edessans had a kingdom on the eastern side of Syria, which included Edessa, Amida, and all the way down through to Palmyra, and possibly down as far as Pella, which was below Damascus. That was their kingdom on the eastern borders of Judea and Syria. And so they controlled Palmyra. It was the biggest and richest city in the east of the empire. And so the son of Jesus was in Palmyra. And so we have now Joseph of Arimathea going to Palmyra to meet the son of Jesus to see if he will disarm, because he still had a large army. And also to change their religion from Nazarene Judaism into simple Judaism, into Christianity. And of course there's this great contention between Evelach and Joseph of Arimathea, who doesn't want to change his religion, and he doesn't want to disarm. So Joseph of Arimathea says, well, if you don't disarm, then we're going to let the Parthians come in and destroy your city, because the Parthian king had an army waiting. Because the Parthians realized that the Edessan monarchy were now very weak, because they just fought a battle with Rome and lost. So they'd lost most of their army already, so they knew that the Edessans were quite weak. And the Parthians were just waiting to come in and invade Edessa and destroy it. So there's this great standoff between Joseph of Arimathea and the king of Saras. So this comparison, and it's interesting because no one would have understood what Saras was, what King Evelach, who he was. You would never understand that unless you had already deciphered A, who Joseph of Arimathea was, that he was actually Josephus Flavius, and B, who Jesus was, that he was actually a warrior monarch of Edessa and Palmyra. If you hadn't have actually gone through that process before, you could never work out what Arthurian history was actually talking about here. And yet this Pesher comparison between this king of Palmyra and the Babylonian king is so perfect that the authors of Arthurian history must have known everything I've just talked about. So although all of this has been lost to modern academia, modern biblical history and secular history knows nothing about this, although it's all been lost to modern scholarship, the people who wrote the Vulgate cycle, this is Walter Map and Robert de Boron, knew all of this history. So they were in possession of a lot more history than we have in the modern era, and they were using it and covering it up because it was heretical. You couldn't say that Jesus had a son and he was a king now of Palmyra. You could not mention that. So it had to be covered up in a pesher fashion with a comparison with characters from the Old Testament. And they wrote all about it in order to preserve this history. So it's interesting. What it is saying, and we've already discovered this, I think, in what we've been talking about, is that Arthurian history contains an awful lot of real history that is now missing from modern scholarship. It's been lost. And the only place you can actually get it back is by reading Arthurian history. Same as I was talking about with the story of Pompey the Great. That story has been lost from modern scholarship. Modern scholarship knows nothing about it, but Arthurian history does. And from what I demonstrated in the book, it's actually a true piece of history. It's all about Mithras. It's not about... Well, it is about pirates as well, because the pirates were there. But it's actually a story about Mithras being introduced into Rome. And that element has all been lost from modern scholarship. So this is why Arthurian history is so important, because it fills in all of the gaps, and quite a lot of gaps at that. So, yeah, it's an interesting topic.
Just a couple more questions, Ralph. Geoffrey of Monmouth talked about an African army invading Britain, which seems to make no sense.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good topic. Yeah, this is why modern historians will dismiss it all as being mythology because they don't understand it. I had this wonderful argument recently with Guy Househall, who's an Arthurian historian who tried to write a proper historical analysis of Arthurian history and failed completely because he didn't understand any of it. I mean, here's a guy who wrote a book about Arthurian history and he never mentioned the Vulgate cycle once, which is like writing a history of Jesus and never mentioning the Gospels. I mean, it's just crazy. So
well, the Vulgate cycle is one of the later books. Maybe he doesn't feel that it's canonical.
Yeah, but most of the interesting information is in the Vulgate cycle, and it's the largest book of all of them. I mean, it's 9 volumes. It's bigger than anything else within Arthurian history, and it deserves analysis. And I know why he did it, because it's difficult, and so he skipped it because it's too difficult. And he didn't understand it, and he didn't understand this African army business either. So Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote the first proper history of King Arthur, he goes through all of the history of Arthur, and then Arthur dies, he goes off to Avalon, and then he goes into the next generations, and he goes on, I think, 4 generations from the death of King Arthur, and then he says that a large African army, 160,000 strong, invaded Britain from Ireland. And, of course, most historians will read this and think, oh, geez, this is all, complete bonkers. This is mythology. There was no African army in Ireland. What is Monmouth on about? Well, he was correct, but just not correct in the way you might imagine, which is why, again, you need a broad understanding of all these subjects. Otherwise, you'll never understand what on earth it's talking about. And I think I'm probably, again, like the Saras issue, I'm probably the first person who has ever deciphered what this is all about. And the giveaway is that the king and his seneschal, the African king and his seneschal, are called Gormund and Isambard. And so I immediately knew the answer to this problem because I'd written about all of this before in my book, Mary Magdalene, Princess of Orange, because one of the chansons from Normandy, one of the troubadour songs from Normandy was called Gormund and Isambard. It's the same two people. And the song of Gormund and Isambard is not about Africans being in Ireland and invading England. It's about Africans in North Africa invading southern France. And the Africans involved, of course, is the Muslim invasion of northern France in the 8th century. Because remember, the Muslims pushed all the way across, defeating all of the nations across the Near East. All of North Africa used to be Christian. All of those nations were defeated. And most of the populations expelled or killed or whatever. And then they invaded all of Spain, and then they invaded France. And this is what the story of Gormund and Isambard is all about. It's about the invasion of southern France by the Muslims. And these are the Africans, because they came from North Africa, of course. And they pushed all the way up through France to Tours, where they had the great battle of the city of Tours. You know, the battle that was won by Charles Martel, the Hammer, who defeated the Muslims at the Battle of Tours and pushed them back out again. But that wasn't the last of the invasions. There was another invasion where they came back again and pushed up and through Provence and conquered just about the city of Orange. And of course, I'd written all about this before because this was the influential city of Orange that was ruled. It was an independent principality that was ruled by the princes of Orange. And so I already knew about all of this story, and I knew its connections with Arthurian history. It's all linked in again because the person who links it is Wolfram von Eschenbach, because Wolfram wrote Parsifal, which is his big Arthurian history. It's one of the best Arthurian histories out there, actually. But his other great book, which is less well known, is Wilhelm. And Wilhelm is the story of William of Orange, Guillaume de Gaulogne, who was the Prince of Orange in southern France. And he did exactly the same as Charles Martel, but about 70 years later, at the beginning of the, at the end of the 8th century? Yeah, end of the 8th century. And he pushed the Muslims out of Provence in southern France, down and over the Pyrenees into Spain. And so this story, which Monmouth has included into Arthurian history, is part and parcel of the same story of the battle for freedom, which in the first century was the battle for freedom of Jesus pushing out the Romans. But by the time these stories were being written, that story had changed somewhat. So now the battle was not against the Romans, the battle was against the Muslims. This is what the Crusades were all about. But the Crusades didn't start in the first Crusade in 1096. They started long before that, in the 8th century with Charles Martel, who was in a way having the first crusade pushing the Muslims out of France. And then William of Orange did the same. He pushed the Muslims back out of France again in the late 8th century. And this was the subject of Gormund and Isambard, because the Muslim king who invaded, according to Wolfram von Eschenbach, was Gormund, and his seneschal was Isambard, which is why this troubadour song was written, called Gormund and Isambard. So this is what Monmouth was trying to say. He was trying to reset the Arthurian story into not so much battling against the Romans, but now the big problem was battling against the Muslims. It was the start of the Crusades. And so that's why we had this Italian Arthur that I was talking about before, where the Italian Arthur was actually Roger I, who was trying to push the Muslims out of Italy. And it's all part and parcel of Arthurian history. You see how malleable this Arthur character is. He is the great hero character who can be used in several different situations to liberate his people from control, as it were, from oppression. So, yeah, that was a very interesting part of Arthurian history, that this mythology, which no one could understand, was actually a part of real history. It's the history of southern France.
Just so the audience knows, there will be a test at the end of the program consisting of 400 multiple choice questions. Good luck.
And you've got to get 70% minimum pass mark. It's good, isn't it? That's what I say. It's such a fascinating subject because there are so many parts of history involved in this, which are pertinent to the modern era. I mean, we had a question before from a viewer about why is this pertinent to the modern world. Well, this question of the Muslim invasion of Europe is pertinent to the modern era because these kings of Orange, the princes of Orange, went on to become the princes of Orange in Holland. This is where the princes of Orange came from. They came from southern France, from the city of Orange in southern France. But they eventually moved to Holland and became the principal royal family involved in the Reformation. So all of the Reformation, the prevention of the end of Catholic rule in Europe was controlled by the Princes of Orange, these very same Princes of Orange. So the much later Prince of Orange was William III, who had by that time had become a King of England. He was William of Orange of England. And it was William of Orange who chased James II out of Ireland at the Battle of the Boyne, which was the pivotal battle that won the Reformation for the Protestant Church. That's why all of Northern Europe, including England, Scotland, and Northern Germany and Scandinavia, and all those places became Protestant, because William of Orange won the battle against the Catholics, who were, at that time, I suppose, led by Louis XIV. The army in Ireland at the time, the battle has nothing to do with Ireland. The battle at the time was between William III of England, who had the Dutch Blue Guard, he had the Scandinavians, he had the Germans all on his side, and the opposition in Ireland was actually the French army of Louis XIV. So this was a great European intercontinental battle fought in Ireland. And it was fought over religion, of course. So, and it was the Reformation that gave us the Industrial Revolution. We would not have had an Industrial Revolution without the Reformation, because it gave the people the opportunity to think without Catholic control. So all of the scientific achievements that arrived with the Industrial Revolution happened because that battle had been won. And who won that battle? It was the Princes of Orange. And where did the Princes of Orange came from? Well, they came from Orange in southern France. And what did they do in southern France? Well, they were battling the Muslims back in the 8th century, which is part of Arthurian history. You see where it all interconnects. It's part of the modern world. The modern world would not exist if it was not for these events within Arthurian history, which is quite fascinating. This is how this is all relevant to the modern world. And as I said before, we don't want to allow history to repeat itself. If you don't understand history, you're doomed to repeat the events of the past.
One last question, and it's from the audience. Before I ask it, where can the audience buy this new book or any one of your many books? Where's the easiest place for them?
Yeah, I suppose in the modern world, I like the tablets. So it's available on Apple, it's available on Kindle at your local Amazon store. The book is now available at, it's just been printed as a a paperback book at Adventures Unlimited in America.
David Hatcher Childress' company.
Yep, he does the printing of all my books over there, so he's got it in now, and it should be rolling out across America now in the shops because he actually distributes to the shops as well. So yes, if you're in the States, the best place probably is Adventures Unlimited. If you're in Europe, I'm afraid you're onto Amazon because that's the only place it's really available. But it's available all over the place. It's very easy to get hold of. It's the Grail cipher, and it's the fourth part of the King Jesus trilogy. So this is now a trilogy in 4 parts, which I think that came from Douglas Adams, didn't it? He had it in his book, in his science book.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
That's the one, yeah. A trilogy in 4 parts. It's nice if you can understand some of the background before it. So it's nice to start with the King Jesus trilogy to start with. But that's 3 books. And they're quite long books as well. So that
I think each book stands alone.
They do.
But they work so much better if you read them in order.
You can read it as a standalone book, but it does refer back, of course, to the previous books. But there is a synopsis of the previous books before we roll into, Arthurian history. So you can read it as a standalone book.
So the audience's last question of the day, and what a show we've done. We've almost gone 3 hours now.
Yes.
So for you and I, that's just a short talk.
Yeah, this is just half time. We'll come back for more later.
Yes. This is part 1 of 10. No. What is Ralph Ellis's opinion on the significance of the Fisher Kings?
Yes, the primary monarchs of Arthurian history are the Fisher Kings, the Wounded King, and the Holy Hermit. And they actually feature more especially in the Vulgate cycle, than King Arthur does. I mean, King Arthur really is a bit player. I mean, he's not very big at all within all of this. The main king is King Pelles, who's the Fisher King, and King Palahan. And these are titles, of course. These are not just single kings. These are titles. And the Wounded King is the eunuch, of course. So the eunuch, the Wounded King, is most probably the chief knight who becomes the Bishop of the Grail and is therefore castrated and therefore becomes the Wounded King. So the Wounded Kings will include, any of the Galahads would have been the Wounded King. The other king who's very, very much allied to the Wounded King is the Fisher King. And the Fisher King is probably at one point King Arthur, but of course this is just a title, so it can go across many generations. And the Fisher King is the King of Pisces. That's why he's called the Fisher King. So again, we're talking astrology here. One of the biggest parts of Arthurian history is the zodiac and the constellations. Of the zodiac, the processional constellations. So again, we're talking about the precession of the equinox and Aries turning into Pisces in the 1st century. So Jesus and Arthur were both the first of the Fisher Kings because they were born when Pisces became dominant, which was in about AD 10. So yes, King Arthur would have been one of the first of the Fisher Kings, but he doesn't appear to be always the Fisher King within the Vulgate cycle. Sometimes it seems to be other kings, and it seems to be the kings of the previous generation, presumably because they were the kings when Aries turned into Pisces, so they called themselves the Fisher Kings. And then he was the first son of Arthur, was the first son of the Fisher Kings. So we have a line of Fisher Kings within Arthurian history who are the kings of Pisces. And in a way, the popes have taken up this title, because if you look at the popes quite often, and especially, I suppose the bishops as well, they will often wear the fish mouth mitre. So if you look at the crown or mitre of the pope and the bishops, you will quite often see it looks like a fish mouth, because they are the fisher kings. And the pope, of course, still wears, he only becomes the pope when he is given the fisher ring. Now, it's said that the pope wears the fisher ring because Jesus was a fisherman. He was fishing for fish on the Sea of Galilee. But of course, none of this is reality. This is all to do with astrology. Jesus was not on the Sea of Galilee fishing for fish. He was fishing for followers of the era of Pisces. So when Aries turned into Pisces, all his followers had to change their religion, as it were, and start following Pisces instead of Aries. Instead of being the Lamb of God, they became the fisher of men. And so he was changing his followers. He was looking for followers into the new processional era of Pisces. And that's why it has Jesus fishing on the Sea of Galilee, because he was catching people. He wasn't catching fish. He was catching believers in the new era of Pisces. And so the Pope is following in the same tradition. He's following in the same fisherman tradition of the era of Pisces. And that's why if you look at most of the images of Jesus from the Reformation era and the Renaissance era, you will see Jesus in a sort of almond shape. That almond shape is the Vesica Piscis. It's the sign of Pisces. And so you even have Jesus within the shape of the sign of Pisces. So all of this is about astrology. And you might think that astrology is nothing to do with the gospel story, or Nazarene Judaism, or even simple Judaism. But it was actually a central part of Judaism. And I think we've touched on this before. Did we talk about the Hamat zodiac on the Sea of Galilee? Anyway, if you go to the Sea of Galilee, just below Tiberias, about 4 kilometers, about 2 kilometers south of Tiberias, you'll come to Hamat Tiberia, which is it's an old palace and spa center. It's got a spa there as well. But it's also got a synagogue, and this is it's a 1st century synagogue. And all of the early synagogues in Judea and in Jordan have zodiacs on the floor, so they'll have a mosaic zodiac. And so the central component within Judaism, Nazarene Judaism, within the 1st century, was the zodiac. It was a central part of their religion. This is why Judaism as we know it has changed so much after the 1st century. It is no longer the sort of Egypto-Judaism that it was before, that would have venerated the zodiac. And so, this was one of the central components of Judaism. In fact, Judaism has changed so much in recent years that it was about 5 years ago or so, there was a group of fundamentalist Orthodox Jews from Jerusalem went up to Hamat and tried to hack the zodiac to pieces because they said it was not Judaic. And yet this is a zodiac that has all of the symbols of Judaism, including the Temple of Jerusalem, on the top of it. It is quite clearly a zodiac in a synagogue. But they think it's so un-Judaic in modern Judaic terms that they wanted to destroy it. The kings, the fisher kings within Arthurian legend, are referring to the first of the kings of Pisces, and that would have been the first kings of the Nazarene Judaism, who venerated the zodiac. Yeah, we didn't do so much on the zodiac within this talk, did we? Anyway, if you read the book, you will find that the signs of the zodiac run all the way through Arthurian history. And it's also probably a part of the end of Arthurian history as well when we come on to Avalon, because it's quite possible that Avalon is linked to the zodiac as well. And Avalon is funny. There are some central elements of Arthurian legend that just aren't there. I mean, the sword Excalibur is really hardly mentioned at all within Arthurian history, just a few times. And Avalon, within the whole of the Vulgate cycle, Avalon is only mentioned once. So what you might think is a central component of Arthurian history is not actually that greater part of the story. So I do a piece at the end of the book on Avalon, but it's a bit speculative because we have so little information about what Avalon is. All we're told is that Avalon is in the west. You have to go to the west to arrive at Avalon, which makes it sound a little bit like the Greek Elysian heaven or fields. It has great resonance with the Greek stories there. But it also, it seems to refer to things that are round. So in the Welsh, what do they call it? In the Welsh, it's called the Cor Siri. I'm not very good at Welsh. I'm sorry if any Welsh people are listening. And in the Latin, it's called the Chorea Giganticum, which means the dance of the giants. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Avalon seems to be linked with circles from the Aramaic, meaning a circle. And when we go to the west, we arrive at Stonehenge, which is called, as I said, Cor Siri, or Chorea Giganticum in the Latin, which is known as the Giant's Dance. And there are many similarities between the descriptions here of Avalon and the descriptions we have within Monmouth's history, because Monmouth describes Stonehenge, of course, within his descriptions of Stonehenge. And so I make a tentative link between Avalon and Stonehenge, because Monmouth says that the great burial ground was Stonehenge. In fact, he says that Stonehenge was actually made as the tomb for Uther Pendragon, who was the father of King Arthur. Now, of course, we know that Stonehenge actually is much, much older than that. However, he is directly linking Stonehenge with the burial of Arthur's father and also with the son of Arthur, who are both buried at Stonehenge. And Avalon seems to have this strange linguistic link with Stonehenge as well, in being a circle. And from my previous books, and I'm not sure if we touched on this, what book is it in? It's in Thoth, Architect of the Universe as well, where I talk about Stonehenge. And the layout of Stonehenge is actually processional. It is like a zodiac. So it is giving, in a very, very graphic and obvious fashion, it is showing the precession of the equinox, which is what processional zodiacs are all about. So Stonehenge is a processional zodiac. And all of Arthurian history is about processional zodiacs as well. And so we get these many links between Stonehenge and Arthurian history. And so I end the book with looking at these links and seeing how Stonehenge could be the Arthurian Avalon. And so King Arthur would have been buried at Stonehenge, because this also links in with the King Jesus book, because anyone who's read that book will realize that I said that Jesus was crucified, as Josephus mentions it, but reprieved and sent into exile. And he was sent into exile in Fortress Diwa in Chester in England. And so he was in exile in England until his death, from AD 70 up until his death. And in Fortress Diwa, they created a Temple of the Zodiac. And it's the only one in the whole of the Roman Empire. It's completely unique. And you have to ask yourself, who in the Roman Empire would be building a Temple of the Zodiac? Well, the only equivalent temples we have, not quite the same, but, sort of equivalent, are the ones we have in Judea, which were to do with the Nazarene Jews, like the one on the Sea of Galilee, which was also a synagogue or a temple dedicated to the Zodiac. And so I said Jesus was exiled to Fortress Diwa. But after his death, what could the Romans do with his remains? I mean, he was only there because he was a dangerous rebel who had created a revolt in the eastern borders of the empire. And the reason they sent him to what became England was because it was the furthest point in the Roman Empire that you could possibly get from Judea. There was nowhere further. So what they had done is they'd removed him from his power base in Syria and Judea and located him as far away as they possibly could from that region. And so they located him in Chester. But what could they do after his death? They don't want to take his remains back to Judea, because that would just be inviting another Jewish revolt. They probably didn't want to just burn them, because that was against Judaic religion anyway, and they wanted to, have some dignity, I suppose, to his end. And within Judaism, you're supposed to be you're putting in an ossuary to allow your body to rot, and so you end up as a pile of bones. And then you take the bones and you put the bones in a small ossuary, and you bury the small box of bones. That was the traditional Judaic method of burial. So it sort of seemed likely to me that if the Romans had the body of Jesus in this would have been about AD 95 or something like that, that a logical place to actually bury him would actually be Stonehenge, because Stonehenge was not operational at that time. The Druids had all been wiped out in AD 60 something, when the Romans destroyed the rest. The last of the Druids were destroyed over in Anglesey in about AD 60. So Stonehenge was no longer an operating temple. It was just there as a sepulchre, a monument. And it would be a logical place to put the remains of King Jesus. This is King Arthur, of course, because they are the same person. It would be a logical place for the Romans to actually dispose of his body, because it was still an awful long way from Judea and Syria. It would keep him away from his power base in Syria. And yet it would still be a dignified end for a Nazarene Jew who venerated the processional zodiac, because Stonehenge is a processional zodiac. It is the design of the zodiac. Anyway, there's not that much evidence and proof that this is where he ended up, but that was my final thought at the end of the book, that King Arthur, King Jesus, ended up in Stonehenge. Stonehenge is Avalon.
Well, I know what the audience is thinking. Just when you start getting into it, it's over.
Yes.
Just to remind the audience, the website for Ralph Ellis is edfu-books.com. That's ed, F-U, hyphen, don't spell hyphen, just put a dash there, books.com. Ralph, what a show.
Yeah, it was nice. It was good. It was a good review of much of the book. But there's an awful lot more there. There's a lot of detail there that obviously we can't do in a talk.
Well, that's just it. If anyone's listening to this thinks he's sold the farm already and you're getting the milk for free, it's not the case. There's so much more in the books. I've read Ralph's books before. They're extremely detailed, just like these interviews. They're must-buys. Pick up one of the books, start with the King Jesus trilogy, and then get the newest one, the Grail Cipher. That would be my recommendation. Ralph Ellis, anything left to say?
No, I think we've covered everything there. And thanks very much for all your questioning. It's nice to be able to bounce off, answers to good questions and so on. So, yeah, it was a great show. Great show.
Ralph Ellis, thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
My pleasure.